Videos showing the moments leading up to George Floyd's death are playing a key role in the first days of ex-Minneapolis officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial. Yesterday, prosecutors played body camera footage from officers as well as surveillance video from inside the convenience store where Floyd was accused of passing a counterfeit bill. While reliving the events that took place on May 25, 2020, witnesses recalled feeling rather helpless and guilty as Floyd struggled for breath. So for more on this, let's bring in attorney Paul Batista to talk a little bit about yesterday's testimony and then moving forward. So Paul, thanks for joining us. Christopher Martin, he was the cashier at the Cup Foods who took the alleged fake $20 bill from Floyd. And he testified in court yesterday that he wasn't even really aware that the bill was counterfeit. And he also testified that he felt like Floyd may have been high at the time. How important are these factors and his testimony when taking into account, the way events unfolded?
Well, you have to look at it cumulatively, Anne-Marie. There's been a lot of really pretty compelling testimony about the prosecution, which is to be expected. This is their case. And this young man who was at the convenience store, I think, did two kind of mutually inconsistent things. He did say that as soon as George Floyd handed him what purported to be or pretended to be a $20 bill, this very perceptive young man, he's only 19 years old, determined that it was a fake. But he also said, and this kind of will, I think, play into whatever defense it is that Chauvin is developing, he gave the opinion that George Floyd, after engaging in conversation with the young man, was, quote, high. So that kind of opens the door to an issue that has not yet previously been resolved. What significance it has, time will tell. But remember, we're only in the opening innings of this. We've got the prosecution's case, which is powerful, but we're going to have Chauvin's case. And that introduction of the concept of a perception that he was high does, I think, possibly play into the police defense that we are soon going to be hearing.
On the flip side, Paul, could a case be made, I'm sorry for the pun, but could you also surmise that clearly the prosecution knew that this witness, because he is their witness, was going to say that he believed that Mr. Floyd was high, and so by getting it out there front and center as a witness of theirs mentioning it, it sort of cements in the mind of the jurors, well, the prosecution is being upfront about this, as opposed to, once the attorney for George Floyd gets up there and says, did you think that there was something wrong with George Floyd? And he says, oh, he was high. And everybody goes, oh. I mean, I sort of wonder about getting it up there front at the very beginning, which sort of in the mind of the jurors, jurors better than I do, like what they would think about that. Would that give them some sense that the prosecution is being upfront and thus trustworthy?
I don't think so, Vlad. I mean, that's a very perceptive comment. My own educated guess is that the young clerk's comment, which was almost gratuitous, that George Floyd appeared to be high during a conversation about baseball and football, I really don't think the prosecution anticipated that, but you're right. Sometimes a prosecutor is right to introduce an issue to try initially to try to negate it later on. We, as in all trials, will have to see how that plays out.
Another sort of major, or I guess perhaps impactful thing as a member of the audience that we heard is the emotional toll that witnessing this event took on the eyewitnesses. Now, this doesn't go to sort of any facts about the case in any way, but it was really sort of important, or it seemed as if it was important for the prosecution to ask those sorts of questions. How did this make you feel, and that sort of thing. What kind of effect do we expect this to have on the jury? And I'm also wondering, in your experience, does this sort of thing have a lingering effect? Because we know sort of after the eyewitness testimony, we're going to move on to expert testimony. And they're going to start talking about, medical things or talking about police training. I would presume that the testimony is going to become less emotional. And so by the time the jury is deliberating, there will be sort of a period of time between, watching witnesses openly weeping on the stand and their deliberations.
Well, I have a little bit of an unorthodox answer to that observation, which is, very perceptive, Anne-Marie. This is a trial not about the reactions of witnesses and bystanders. This is, I hate to be blunt, a trial about Derek Chauvin's guilt or innocence of a specific conduct. I am shocked at two things. Shocked is the wrong word. Surprised at two things: that the prosecution was able, after having the bystanders talk about what they saw, what they heard, what they said, then were allowed to talk about feelings they've had for the last year. I wasn't able to help him. I can't sleep at night. The defense, and I don't want to criticize any lawyers. He may have the world's greatest strategy, the defense lawyer. But at that point, I would have stood up after the witness had testified about what did I see, what did I hear, and then tried to testify about how I felt and still feel a year later. I would have objected. And my sense of this judge, I'll add this, judges are good, bad, and indifferent. This gives every sign of being a very competent, experienced judge. And my gut tells me that the judge would have sustained an objection about how I, as a bystander, feel a year later. It has nothing to do with guilt or innocence. Will it have a lingering effect? Sure, we're all human beings.
Paul, I don't know if you know this because it probably varies state by state, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but one of the things that struck me in listening to Mr. Martin, the young clerk there, and we've heard this over and over in the course of the 3 days, people who witnessed what happened to George Floyd expressing some sense of guilt. And in this particular case, his guilt was around what he perhaps feel was the impetus for everything that followed, which is that that they believed that there was a there was a counterfeit bill that was presented in the store. He mentions that that his store policy was that if the owners found that the bill was counterfeit, it was pulled out of their own pay, which I've never heard of before because, how are you supposed to know? Right. Like, I mean, I guess we can all sort of guess if it's really, really bad. But anyway, he mentions that. And it sort of raises an interesting question, which you've heard over and over from activists, right? Which is, call the police if somebody is doing something, if they're breaking the law. But don't call the police if you think somebody is acting in a way that is off-putting. And I wonder if it comes out in trial that George Floyd did not know that that bill was counterfeit, what that would mean. In other words, calling the police on somebody who's passing is that breaking the law across the country? If I get a bad $20 bill and I go to the supermarket and I spend it, would they call the cops on me?
Listen, Vlad, there's something very fundamental in our system. If you and I are walking down the street and we see what we as laymen believe may be criminal activity, such as harassing Asian Americans, we as citizens have an obligation to bring potential illegality to the attention of law enforcement. Now, this young man, I'm a little shocked that he was going to be docked if in fact it was a a phony $20 bill. He was going to lose a real $20 bill. And I don't see anything improper in young Mr. Martin, who's an extraordinarily articulate young man, or the manager, whom we didn't hear, called the attention of the police to what I think, minor as it may be, most people would consider a minor or petty criminal offense. This is a poor neighborhood. Palming off a $20 bill is going to have consequences on the cup store, its owners, and certainly on young Mr. Martin.
All right, Paul Batista, thank you very much. Appreciate it as always.
Great to see you guys after so much time.
Yes, hopefully one day we'll have you back here when we all can come back to the studio. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you so much.
And we want to remind you again that day 4 of Derek Chauvin's trial is set to get underway shortly. You can stream it live right here on CBSN starting at 10:30 a.m. Eastern.